December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes. Snow falls like ash, muffling the sound of war. The forest looks peaceful from the air, just frost-covered trees and narrow roads buried under white silence. But beneath that silence, hundreds of German guns are waiting. It's the last gamble of a dying empire. The Ardennes offensive, what history will call the Battle of the Bulge. Inside a freezing command bunker near Prüm, Colonel Ernst Keller of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division warms his hands over a lantern. His men have been told that this attack will change the course of the war. Hitler himself promised that the Americans are soft, that their morale is collapsing, that one sharp blow will split their army in two. Keller believes it. He believes because belief is all that's left. At dawn, German artillery opens up. Thousands of shells scream across the forest, tearing the air apart. For the first time in months, the Wehrmacht is on the move. Panzer divisions roll out from the mist, engines growling, crews praying the fog will hide them from Allied aircraft. For 2 days, it works. The weather grounds the American planes. The fog becomes Germany's last ally. Tanks roll through the snow. Infantry advances by torchlight. The Allies fall back, confused, scattered, cold. Then the sky clears. On December 23rd, sunlight cuts through the clouds for the first time in a week. The temperature drops. The snow turns to glass. And from the west, a sound begins to rise. A hum. A whisper at first, then a roar. Hundreds of American artillery batteries open fire at once. The shells arc high, bright as silver against the pale sky. The Germans brace for the familiar whistle of steel and the distant thump of explosions. But this time, it's different. The shells detonate in midair. 50 feet above the ground, hundreds of explosions bloom simultaneously, turning the forest into a storm of metal. Each burst shreds everything beneath it: men, weapons, snow, trees. The air becomes solid with fragments. There's nowhere to hide. Foxholes mean nothing. A German sergeant dives behind a log and screams, "They're shooting the air!" No one answers. Within minutes, entire formations vanish under invisible fire. Units disappear without a trace. Command posts go silent. The artillery observers report back, terrified. The Americans have learned to explode shells in the sky. They kill us without aiming. Keller stares through his binoculars at the flashes bursting above the treetops. His aide asks what's happening. He doesn't answer, because he doesn't understand. All he knows is that something impossible has appeared on the battlefield. An American weapon that seems to see without eyes, to think without men. Later that night, as he writes his situation report, he finds the words his superiors will use again and again in the coming weeks. Enemy artillery displays unnatural accuracy and effect. Morale impact severe. What he doesn't know, what no one on his side knows, is that the secret isn't accuracy. It's intelligence. Each shell, each ordinary-looking projectile, carries inside it a machine smaller than a fist. A machine that can feel the presence of its target. A machine that listens to the air and decides when to kill. The Germans had been laughing for years at American gadget warfare, mocking the obsession with machines and mass production. But tonight, for the first time, they are not laughing. They are running. And above them, the American shells keep thinking. The story of the proximity fuse didn't begin in the Ardennes, or even in Europe. It began years earlier, in quiet laboratories where the war didn't exist yet. Only curiosity and fear of the next one. In 1939, when the world was still pretending to be at peace, a handful of physicists in Washington, D.C., gathered around a simple question. Can a machine know when it's close to something? That question would become the most dangerous in modern warfare. The man who first believed it could was a naval scientist named Merle Tuve. He wasn't a soldier. He was a dreamer with a head full of equations. Tuve worked at the Carnegie Institution, building radio transmitters that could measure the ionosphere. When war came, his instruments stopped listening to the sky and started teaching shells how to think. The British had already experimented with radio-based fuses, but their designs were unreliable, fragile, and useless in the vibration of flight. Tuve's team decided to start from zero. Their goal was terrifyingly simple. Create a fuse small enough to fit in a 5-inch shell, tough enough to survive being fired from a gun, and smart enough to explode within a few meters of its target. They called it the VT fuse, variable time. Inside its metal casing was a miracle of compression. A miniature vacuum tube the size of a thimble, a power source, a tiny radio transmitter that sent a signal forward. When that signal bounced off a nearby object, an airplane wing, a tree, a soldier, it interfered with itself. The change in frequency triggered the detonator. The shell didn't need to hit its target. It just needed to sense it. That idea changed everything. But in 1940, it was still theory. Every test failed. The tubes shattered under acceleration. The circuits shorted from the shock. They fired hundreds of duds into the Chesapeake Bay. Tuve's team refused to quit. He told his engineers, "If you can make it work once, you can make it work always." Then, one winter afternoon, it did. A test shell burst in midair, just yards from its drone target. The shockwave knocked the plane out of the sky. The observers fell silent. One of them muttered, "That's not a shell anymore, that's a hunter." From that day forward, the fuse became the most secret weapon in the Allied arsenal, more secret than radar, more restricted than the atomic bomb. The fear wasn't what it could do, but what would happen if the Germans copied it. If the Wehrmacht ever figured out how to make shells that exploded in proximity, the skies over London would turn to fire. So the Americans locked the project behind layers of silence. Engineers were divided into cells. No one knew what the other group was building. They were told only that the parts they handled were for radio research. The finished fuses were shipped in sealed crates guarded by armed MPs. Every spent shell casing was collected and destroyed. Even the term proximity fuse was classified. Soldiers called them variable timers, smart caps, or simply VT. Mass production began in 1942. The Navy got the first shipments, using them in anti-aircraft guns in the Pacific. Japanese pilots started falling from the sky without ever being touched. Crews reported entire squadrons vanishing after a few salvos. The VT fuse turned every gun into a sky minefield. But it wasn't until late 1944 that the US Army finally got permission to use them on land. Eisenhower's staff had begged for them for months, but the scientists resisted. If one fuse fell intact into German hands, the entire secret could collapse. So for 2 years, the fuses stayed at sea, where recovery was impossible. Then came the Ardennes. By December, intelligence warned of a massive German buildup. The Allies were stretched thin. Winter had grounded the planes, and the Luftwaffe was back in the air. The scientists finally gave their consent. Tuve's team knew the risk. But they also knew what would happen if they waited too long. Thousands of crates of VT-fused shells were loaded onto trucks under armed guard. Each driver carried a sealed letter instructing him to destroy his cargo if ambushed. The convoys rolled through Belgium at night, engines humming like conspirators. In a tent near Liège, ordnance officers uncrated the first shells. They were identical to normal 155mm rounds, but heavier, smoother, with no visible fuse. The gunners looked at them and shrugged. "So what's special?" one asked. An engineer whispered, "They can hear you coming." The soldiers laughed. A week later, they stopped laughing. On December 23rd, American artillery units around Bastogne fired their first volleys of VT shells. The Germans, clustered in the woods, didn't even know what was happening until the sky itself began to explode. Observers described the effect as a wall of invisible machine guns. Each shell detonated just above head height, shredding everything beneath it. Snow turned red. The air smelled of ozone and metal. The German advance froze in place. Entire battalions disappeared under clouds of shrapnel. General George Patton wrote in his diary, "The new fuses are devastating. The Krauts have no idea what hit them." Within 48 hours, the Battle of the Bulge had changed. The Germans, once certain they were breaking through, were suddenly buried under an enemy they couldn't see. From the command posts came frantic messages. "They have radar shells. They are shooting without line of sight." They were half right. The shells weren't radar. They were something worse. They were intelligence, weaponized. And for the first time in history, a machine, not a man, decided the moment of death. The reports began arriving within hours. At first, the German High Command thought they were mistakes, clerical errors, exaggerations from frightened men. Then they came from everywhere. From Bastogne, from Houffalize, from the Schnee Eifel. Each one said the same thing. American artillery detonates above ground. Casualties extreme. No dud shells recovered. Morale breaking. At the forward aid stations, doctors were speechless. They had seen every wound a war could make, but this was different. The bodies arrived with no bullet holes, no burns, no crushed bones. Just thousands of small, symmetrical tears across the skin, as if the air itself had exploded. A field surgeon near Malmedy wrote in his notebook, "The men are torn apart from above. It is not artillery as we know it. It is a storm made of metal." The soldiers gave it names. Sky mines, the whispering death, the fuses of God. In the woods, where German infantry had once taken comfort in the thick snow and trees, fear spread faster than frost. The old instincts, dig deep, hide, wait, no longer worked. The air killed you now. Corporal Dieter Albrecht remembered crouching in his foxhole, listening to the American guns. "You used to pray the shell would miss you," he said later. "Now you prayed it wouldn't see you." On December 24th, a reconnaissance unit managed to retrieve fragments of the strange shells. They found thin aluminium pieces, wires, bits of glass. The engineers puzzled over them. "It's electrical," one said. "But how?" In Berlin, the fragments were rushed to the Telefunken Research Center. The scientists stared at the tiny vacuum tubes, barely the size of a finger joint. No one had ever seen anything so small survive the shock of firing. It should have been impossible. Dr. Hans Meissner, a physicist who had once worked on German radar, examined one of the components under a magnifying lens and muttered, "This is not a fuse. It's a radio." He was right, partly, but it didn't matter. Germany was out of time. By Christmas, the offensive had stalled. The snow that had hidden them now betrayed them, reflecting the flashes of their guns and drawing American fire. Every time a German battery revealed its position, the VT shells found it within minutes. Observation balloons guided corrections from miles away. The sky itself seemed wired to the enemy's will. In desperation, some commanders ordered their men to hang sheets and branches over their trenches, hoping to confuse the invisible eyes. Others forbade campfires or metal helmets, convinced that the fuses somehow smelled iron. Superstition replaced science. A rumor spread that the Americans were using atomic powder in their shells, a kind of miniaturized bomb. Another claimed that each projectile carried a camera that could see through clouds. None of it mattered. The effect was the same. Paralysis. A German major captured near Bastogne told his interrogators, "Your artillery kills us before we can even aim. We shoot at ghosts. They shoot at the air, and the air obeys them." He wasn't exaggerating. The Americans had achieved something that had never existed before. A battlefield where technology had outpaced comprehension. The VT fuse was not just a weapon. It was a psychological event. Inside the Allied command tent, the mood was different. For the first time in weeks, officers smiled. The artillerymen spoke with awe of their new shells. "You don't need a direct hit anymore," one gunner said. "You just need to get close enough to make the fuse think you're there." In an after-action report, General Omar Bradley wrote, "The introduction of proximity fuses transformed the Ardennes campaign. Their moral effect on enemy troops cannot be overstated." That moral effect was terror. In the villages behind the lines, German civilians who had fled the fighting described the sky as if it had turned into a machine. One woman from Saint-Vith said, "It was like thunder that never stopped, but the thunder came from the snow." For the soldiers, it was worse. The steady rhythm of war, the incoming whistle, the countdown to impact, was gone. The new shells didn't whistle. They didn't warn. They simply arrived, bursting in silent intervals, 1,000 meters apart, always too close. By December 27th, the Wehrmacht's assault units had lost cohesion. Some battalions reported 50% casualties without ever seeing an enemy. Radios crackled with panic. Artillery from nowhere. "Shells explode in the sky. We are under invisible fire." German intelligence officers gathered the reports and tried to draft a countermeasure. Their conclusion was bleak. "We lack the materials and time to replicate the device. Enemy advantage total." In a single week, centuries of military doctrine, dig, hide, advance, counter battery, had collapsed. There was no counter to a weapon that anticipated your existence. By New Year's Eve, the fog returned. The snow began to fall again. The battlefield went quiet. Not because the Americans had stopped firing, but because there was no one left to shoot at. Colonel Keller, who had begun the offensive full of faith, now sat in the ruins of a farmhouse near Bastogne, writing his final report. His handwriting shook with exhaustion. "The enemy has found a way to see without seeing," he wrote. "Our courage means nothing against machines that decide." He put down his pen and listened to the distant thunder rolling over the forest. Each burst sounded identical, mechanical, emotionless. He whispered, "This is not war. This is manufacturing." And for the first time, he realized that Germany had already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the snow was gray with metal. The American gunners called it steel snow, tiny fragments of proximity fuses that glittered in the light like frost. The ground was frozen with history. Every shard was a fingerprint of the new age, war driven not by bravery or chance, but by circuits, frequencies, and physics. After the battle, Allied engineers combed the fields collecting what was left. They found that the fuses had performed beyond expectation, over 80% detonation success, even in sub-zero temperatures. No other technology in the war had such reliability. When the report reached Washington, it was classified, top secret, strategic value incalculable. President Roosevelt himself read it. He underlined one sentence: "The proximity fuse, second only to the atomic bomb, is the most important scientific development of the war." But for the men who had built it, that sentence felt less like triumph and more like prophecy. Merle Tuve and his team of scientists, men who had worked in secrecy for years, sat in their lab in early 1945, surrounded by empty shell casings and burned-out tubes. They had created something magnificent and monstrous. One of the engineers wrote in his notebook, "We have made intelligence without empathy." They called it a mind without mercy. The proximity fuse didn't just change artillery. It changed how humans thought about machines. For the first time, a weapon no longer relied on a human trigger or human timing. It sensed, decided, and acted alone. It was a mechanical instinct, primitive but alive. The future had arrived quietly, in the shape of a small metal brain. When word of the weapon finally reached Allied troops outside the artillery corps, the reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, others were uneasy. A soldier from the 26th Infantry Division said, "It's good it's on our side, but I don't like the idea that it chooses when to kill." No one had the luxury to debate ethics in 1944. But after the war, when the documents were declassified, philosophers, historians, and generals all asked the same question: had humanity crossed a line without noticing? In the Pentagon's after-action review, the proximity fuse was listed as the single most effective technological advantage of the Allied ground forces. Radar had seen the enemy. The fuse destroyed him. It had saved tens of thousands of lives, perhaps more than it had taken. Without it, the Battle of the Bulge might have dragged on for months. Yet the scientists knew the weapon's secret cost. It had proved that human decision-making was replaceable. Within a year, the same principles that guided artillery shells were being studied for guided bombs and early missiles. The miniature tubes that survived 20,000 G of acceleration inspired new generations of electronics, computers, autopilots, even satellites. The proximity fuse had birthed the digital era without meaning to. In 1946, a former German physicist who had worked on radar visited the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. When he saw the VT fuse, he shook his head. "We could never have done this," he said. "We believed the gun was king. You believed the laboratory was." That belief had rewritten the rules of civilization. The scale of production still staggers historians. By the end of the war, American factories had built more than 22 million proximity fuses. The project employed 80,000 people across 200 plants, half of them women. It was an industrial miracle wrapped in silence. No one outside those plants knew what they were building. Each worker assembled a tiny part, a coil, a filament, a capacitor, and never saw the whole. Only when the crates left the factory under military escort did the truth exist. Tuve later said, "We created the only weapon in history that could not be explained to the people who built it." And yet, that weapon would define the next century. When the Cold War began, the proximity principle became the foundation of everything. Anti-aircraft missiles, radar-guided bombs, early warning systems. Every smart weapon carried the DNA of those first shells over the Ardennes. It also carried their moral weight. Historians now call the proximity fuse the first automated killer. Before it, every act of destruction required a human's moment of choice. After it, machines began to decide the instant of death. It was a small step technically, but philosophically, it was the birth of autonomy. In 1947, during a congressional hearing, one senator asked Tuve whether he feared what his invention might lead to. Tuve paused, then said quietly, "The fuse has no soul, Senator. But neither does war." He was right, but the words haunted him for the rest of his life. Decades later, when computers guided bombs across continents, his former assistant recalled that Tuve never spoke of the fuse again. He said, "We taught metal to think, and it never stopped thinking." For Germany, the discovery of the fuse's existence after the war was devastating. Telefunken scientists studied captured examples and realized how far behind they had fallen. Not by months, but by worlds. One of them wrote in his report to the Allied occupation authorities, "We fought with hands. They fought with minds." The moral reversal was complete. The nation that had worshipped technology now stood defeated by the only country that had truly mastered it. In the rubble of Berlin, Allied investigators found German plans for radar shells abandoned since 1943. They were crude, theoretical, impractical. The engineers who had designed them were either dead or disillusioned. One note, scribbled in the margin of a blueprint, read, "Too small, too delicate, impossible under war conditions." America had proven otherwise. The impossible had become assembly line routine. When historians look back at the Battle of the Bulge, they often describe it as the last gasp of the German army. But in truth, it was the first breath of the post-war world, a world where intelligence lived in machines, where decisions traveled faster than thought. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon of victory. It was the first whisper of automation, of drones, of guided missiles, of every algorithm that would one day replace instinct with instruction. And like all great inventions of war, it carried the seed of its own horror. Merle Tuve once said, years after the war, "Every invention teaches something. The fuse taught us that we can teach machines to kill. The question is whether we can teach ourselves to stop." His question still hangs over every battlefield, because what began as a tiny spark of radio static in 1944 never truly ended. It just kept evolving, from the forests of the Ardennes to the skies of the modern world. When the war ended, the fuses that had turned the Ardennes into lightning were packed away in crates. The engineers went home. The factories went quiet. The forests grew back over the fields where metal once ruled the air. But something in the world had changed forever. The silence was different now. It was an intelligent silence. In Washington, in a warehouse filled with classified materials, rows of small metal cylinders sat under dim lights. They looked harmless, no bigger than a bottle of ink. Each one had cost more than a soldier's rifle. Each one had thought faster than a human mind. When the guards walked past them, They didn't know they were guarding the beginning of a new kind of life. The proximity fuse had become the seed of everything that followed. Radar-guided bombs, computer targeting, drones, missiles, even the digital processors that now live inside every device we hold. The machine that once listened to the air for enemies now listens for our touch on glass screens. War and progress had merged forever, but for the men who had watched it begin, the victory tasted cold. General Bradley called it the most humane weapon ever built, because it ended battles faster, because it saved lives by killing efficiently. The scientists who built it weren't so sure. Merle Tuve stopped working on military contracts altogether. When asked why, he said, "Once you make a weapon that decides, you can't stop it from deciding again." In Germany, captured officers tried to explain their defeat. Some blamed the weather, some the fuel shortage, some the arrogance of their leaders. But one of them, a colonel who had fought in the Ardennes, wrote in his memoirs, "It was not weather or numbers. It was that they had found a way to make matter obey thought." He understood what many didn't. The Americans hadn't just won the war. They had invented a new one. The war of intelligence against instinct. Every generation since has lived in its shadow. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, smart fuses became smarter. They learned to count altitude, distance, heat. They learned to recognize targets by signature. The echo of Tuve's work rolled across decades, through every piece of guided steel. And in a strange, poetic way, his invention also made peace possible. The same sensors that once listened for airplanes now detect storms. The same circuits that once guided shrapnel now guide satellites. The same logic that once measured death now measures the weather, the cosmos, the heartbeat of the planet. It is the great irony of the 20th century that humanity's most destructive intelligence became its most useful one. But somewhere between those two truths lies the question that no one can answer. When the first proximity shell exploded over the Ardennes, no one realized that humanity had crossed a threshold. For the first time, death had been automated. The sky had become self-aware. That idea, machines deciding who lives and who dies, didn't end with the war. It only grew smaller, faster, quieter. Today, it hides inside drones, inside algorithms, inside invisible systems that calculate risk, profit, and survival. The proximity fuse is still with us. It just no longer needs the sound of a gun to function. In the museums where they display those tiny, fragile shells, visitors often walk past them without noticing. There's no glamour in a fuse, no romance in circuitry. But if you stop and listen long enough, you can almost hear what the Germans heard in those frozen forests. A faint hum. The whisper of a new world being born. One of the last surviving artillerymen from the Battle of the Bulge was interviewed in 1989. He was asked what it felt like to fire those shells. He said, "It felt like God had given us his thunder for a day, and we used it." He paused, then added quietly, "I still wonder if he ever took it back." The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945. The German army never recovered. But the weapon that broke them, the fuse that thought, never stopped evolving. It moved from the snow to the skies, from the skies to the stars. And maybe that's the real story. Not that the Americans built a smarter shell, but that, in doing so, Humanity learned how to make thinking things that would never sleep again. That day in the Ardennes, as the snow turned to fire, the world crossed from the age of men into the age of mines. And the hum of those fuses has never gone silent.